LaRell, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you accepting the invitation to be the first guest on my podcast.
Yes, I'm greatly honored.
I wanted to quickly congratulate you for the recent podcast you've done with Buckangel and with Benjamin Boyce. I was actually just looking at the Buckangel interview earlier today, and I noticed that it's at 50,000 views. So congratulations on
Oh,
that.
wow.
Um, And
Yeah,
so,
I
so that
haven't
brings me
even.
to my first question. That brings me to my first question, which is, how are you handling the fame and the paparazzi?
It's been weird. I've never been recognized for anything this much before, so I can't even keep up with all the comments. My own videos got so many
Oh,
comments, it's hard to keep up with that alone, but the Buck Angel one, I haven't even bothered trying. There's just so many.
yeah, it was really good interview. So to get things started, I kind of wanted to set the stage a little bit for the listeners. So I'm speaking to LaRell Herbert today, who is a detransitioner and also the author of the book Transgender. It's a belief and it can change. And he's just to kind of put things in the right timeline. He's 43 years old, so that's 12 years older than me. And it was actually on Buck Angel's podcast that I first heard about your book, and I thought it was very interesting that your book started out as one thing, but then as you detransition, your book also kind of had to detransition alongside of you. So, with that in mind, I wanted to start by reading an excerpt at the end of the book because I think it really kind of sets the stage for what your mindset is. So, you
Yeah.
write, I once believed with absolute certainty that I was genuinely a female born in a male body. Consequently, I made permanent, life altering decisions based on this believed identity and perceived reality. Now, as I look back and realize that I never actually was a female trapped in the wrong body, but rather had constructed my identity around this belief system, I cannot help but acknowledge the significant potential to help others who share these feelings and may contemplate the same surgical path I took in search of happiness and fulfillment. However, it will never truly bring the happiness and fulfillment they desire. They may be convinced for a time that it has, just as I was. They may initially feel euphoric, finally having bodies that align with their internal sense of self. But what if one day they come to the realization that they only believed they were a female trapped in a man's body because of a particular sequence of experiences in their early formative years led them to develop this identity? It's my argument, based on my own experiences and my training in trauma and various therapy modalities, that gender identity is indeed a product of one's upbringing. So I think let's get into some of those early formative experiences. So why don't you, and I think this will be an interesting point for us to relate to because I was also brought up in the Mormon church. So why don't you tell me about your experience in the Mormon church as a whole?
Okay. Yeah, I was born into the church. My parents were members. My dad, his family goes way back in the church. In fact, I think I wrote about that in the book that Brigham Young is my fourth time great uncle. So, and I guess a lot of Mormons are related to Brigham Young because of the polygamy aspect, and he had so many damn kids and grandkids and things. But I can follow my family line directly to him. And
Hmm.
my mom, she was not a member of the church, but she joined the church at 16 years old when her brother joined. And so then she just fully grasped onto it. And then me being born into it with both parents LDS, it just became my reality. Like there was no questioning it. I never did. I just grew up believing that everything the Mormon church taught was the truth, absolute, irrefutable truth. And therefore, I built my entire reality on that concept. But of course, some of the teachings of the church never felt right to me, especially that I identified that I felt like I was a female in a male body, but I'm being told by the church that if I'm male on this earth, it means I was created male in the spirit world before I even came here. And therefore, I'm going to be male for all of eternity after this life. And my poor little child mind just could not wrap around that concept. I thought, this, what a tragedy
Mhm.
this is. If I honestly feel like I have to experience what it's like to be female, but I'm being told that I will never get that. And so I'm sure that had to play into some of the weirdness, the psychological weirdness of my growing up believing that that was necessary, that that was a had to be a part of my experience. And yeah, and I maintained belief
So
in the
so
church till I was in my 30s.
hmm. So maybe you can tell me a little bit about the influence that your mother's perception on men and the church's perception on men. How did those two different contradictory things influence your view of your own gender?
Yeah, on one hand, I was told that men were superior and that men held the priesthood, and I felt like that gave me some power in the world. In fact, when I decided to transition and become female, there was a part of me that felt like I was literally giving up certain power, certain authority as a man. But in the church, men, as you know, men are, they have the priesthood. The church teaches to respect women and girls, but at the same time, women and girls never have the priesthood like the men do. And so
Mm-hmm.
my mom, she was very anti-man, always talking bad about my dad, always talking bad about male genitalia, constantly around me. So I have this, my household telling me men are terrible monsters, the church telling me men are superior. So it was such a confusing time for me to go through trying to be okay with being a boy. I couldn't. My perceptions of my environment caused me to develop the belief that being a man was something to look down upon, not something to aspire to or be.
So one question: how much do you think that your problem, your confusion around gender, how much do you think was just a product of your natural tendencies, and how much of it was a product of your mom's opinions, or was it just a combination of both? Because I could imagine a situation where somebody has a mother like yours but doesn't necessarily go down the same pathway as yours. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Totally. Yeah, every experience is so different, and it's such a complex sequence of events and experiences that plays into developing a person's identity, and especially a altered gender identity, that I I know that my mother's opinion and the things she would say about men had a heavy influence on my perception of my own gender identity. Even at 5 years old, I would sit in the bathtub and I would cover my penis with a washcloth because I didn't want to see it. At 5 years old, I knew there was something
Mm.
wrong with having that on my body. And I clearly developed the opinion from my environment and people around me that there was something wrong with having that on my body. And I grew up believing that that was just how I felt, that it was something innate to myself. But it wasn't until
Hmm.
just recently where when I've really learned that it absolutely was my formative years that formed those feelings and opinions.
Hmm. And kind of to get into something a little bit more personal, I know, I hope it's not too personal, but in the book you talk about, let's see, how do I word this? You talk about basically growing up with a micro penis, or not having fully developed as much as maybe other people would have. I'm
Right.
wondering if, because to me that almost sounds like maybe there was also something hormonal going on, maybe low testosterone, because I know the hormones are really critical in developing that. Do you think there was something like that going on as well?
For the longest time, I was convinced I had Klinefelter syndrome, which is when you have an
Mm.
extra, was that XXY, or I forget what the chromosome letters are, but I guess someone who has Klinefelter's, for one, I grew up with enlarged breasts as well. I was male with enlarged breasts, and so that went together with the thought that perhaps what was causing these feelings was Klinefelter syndrome, but I never had myself tested for it to see whether I actually did. And
Hmm.
then when I went to do hormone work, it was discovered that my testosterone levels were actually really high. I don't know
Hmm.
when they got high because for my whole life, I clearly had such a tiny penis. It was as if puberty didn't actually hit till I was in my 20s. It was the strangest thing.
Hmm.
But still, my testosterone was really up there when I went to get estrogen.
Yeah, I
So,
mean, just kind of random thought I'm having. This would probably be quite the stretch, but I wonder if there was possibly some avenue with the way that, I mean, it would be quite the stretch, but just with the way that your mom was, the kind of ideology that she was putting on you, I wonder if your body could have actually had some reaction to that. Do you think that might be possible on some level?
absolutely. I'm a firm believer in the concept of epigenetics and the power of belief. And I just watched a video the other day that because it's been said that a trans person's brain has been proven to actually be physically different when they die or to physically
Hmm.
represent that of a female brain. And so then a lot of people look at that and say, okay, that means that being trans is innate to your body, to your system. But what the video went further into say is to acknowledge that you can literally change yourself physically, your physical structure, based on a firmly held belief for a long period of time. And so, what the video kind of proved was that trans people's brains are indeed different by the end of their life because they've held onto this belief. And I too believe that growing
Hmm.
up in my childhood home, being influenced by this so much and having this belief so consistent that it could have literally caused my body to physically stunt itself in the male formation. It's really fascinating to think about.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. Kind of along the same lines there, you talk about in your book how you struggled with weight as a growing up as well, and that even culminated into you having the weight loss surgery, which I noticed growing up in the Mormon Church that there was quite a few people in my ward, and even my own parents got that surgery as well. And I'm kind of, well, first of all, one thought that comes to mind with that is just that Mormons don't really have another outlet for these type of addictions, so it can kind of go into the avenue of food. What do you think of that
Yeah.
idea?
Yes, I absolutely was eating my feelings. I Food was a comfort for me. It still to this day remains a comfort, but since I had the weight loss surgery, it doesn't stick to me like it used to. But yeah, I definitely developed a habit of seeking food for comfort that I wasn't getting in my household. And it was about 12 years old that I started really putting the weight on, and or maybe 10. Yeah, I think about 10 years old was when I started to become chubby and overweight. And by the time I was 16, I was 260 pounds and 334 by the time I was in my 20s. Yeah.
So I can see some parallels there between especially what you write about in your book about the intense shame that you experienced around the having so much weight on your body. I was wondering if you could tell. I thought it was a very interesting story about the weight challenges you faced around getting your helicopter's pilot's license. Can you tell the audience a little bit about that?
Yeah. So it was my dream ever since I was 9 years old to get my helicopter pilot's license. But then when I started doing my flight training, I discovered that already at 14 years old, when I started, I was already pushing the weight limits of the training helicopters. And I think that played into one of my reasons for putting it on hold for a while because I realized, damn, I got to lose some weight before I can even fly these things. But what ended up happening was I found another flight school that had bigger training helicopters that could carry me so I could continue my flight training. but still I was pushing the limits of those helicopters and sometimes exceeded the limits when certain flight instructors would fly with me and we couldn't get the thing off the ground. But it was so embarrassing to every time I'd go to take off and the poor little helicopters struggling like crazy just to lift off the ground and tilted way over to my side because I was so heavy.
Hmm.
Yeah.
All right, I think I'll go ahead and shift gears here a little bit to some of the psychedelic things that you talk about, which is something that
Mm.
I have some experience with as well. So I wanted to start off this part with an excerpt from your book, which I thought was just really great writing altogether.
Oh.
And I think it kind of paints a picture of the effect that psychedelics can have. So it starts off, imagine growing up atop a towering 60-story skyscraper where this lofty abode has been your entire world. Unbeknownst to you, beneath your solitary floor lies a bustling vertical community of 59 other levels, each teeming with life, and even further below, a vibrant earth where people amble along sidewalks, immersed in their daily joys. Throughout your life, you've been under the impression that disposing of waste is as simple as casting it over your balcony's railing, believing it vanishes into a deep, dark abyss, never to resurface. One day, driven by curiosity, you decide to explore the floor below. Initially, you're elated to discover fellow inhabitants, a sense of connection dawning upon you, but this joy soon morphs into profound dismay and guilt as you realize the grave consequences of your actions. Everywhere you look, remnants of your life, empty cereal boxes you once enjoyed, now littering others' balconies, the empty milk bottle from this morning's breakfast, now in the hands of someone on the ground level, trying to clear the mess. This revelation hits you with the force of a tidal wave. You're suddenly and painfully aware of how your actions in your ignorance have impacted the lives of these unsuspecting people. What you thought was a harmless routine of discarding waste over an edge was, in fact, an act that intruded upon and disrupted the lives of many. So I think, at least from my interpretation, there's a couple different ways that I can read that. The first one would be kind of more how you described it, which is realizing how your actions actually affect other people. But then another way I can look at that is maybe you are this whole building, and so you're realizing how your actions are actually affecting other parts of you that you may not be aware of. So what's your interpretation of that?
That's that's an excellent interpretation as well. Yeah. Yeah, I guess what sparked that whole thing was when I realized what psychedelics did for me and how they made me suddenly aware of the interconnectedness of all, not, like you said, not just between us and other people, but the interconnectedness of our own internal system and how we're completely unaware of how we're affecting ourselves. Mostly, I think my thought process was becoming aware of others in the world and how my actions, you tend to become, especially growing up LDS, you grow up with a certain exceptionalism where we literally believed that the church was the only true church on the face of the earth, and I grew up in a world where I was more concerned about myself and what I was doing, and not really realizing that my actions were having such a profound impact on those around me, and then learning, doing more self-help work, self personal growth work, and discovering what all was going on inside of me. That all played into discovering my whole gender identity issues, was to realize that there were parts of me that were completely unaware that other parts existed. Because as we're growing up, we adapt to our environment and we develop certain adaptations and habits and skills and things to, so we can survive in the world based on how we perceived we needed to survive in the world. And in doing so, we completely become oblivious to certain aspects of our own self, our own life, parts of us that are inside of us that are trying to get their needs met, but we don't acknowledge them, or or try to meet their needs in maladaptive ways. So, yeah.
So one thing I thought was interesting is that so you seem to have quite a long history with psychedelics, and it seems like some of the earlier, let's say, trips you did seem to confirm your gender identity as a woman, but then kind of
Yeah.
the later on ones seem to confirm ones that you were actually indeed a man. So how do you kind of reconcile these different epiphanies?
Yeah, it was fascinating because when I discovered what psychedelics could do and what they could make you aware of, like I said, I was scared to death because I thought, what if I take these psilocybin mushrooms and they suddenly make me aware that I shouldn't be living as a woman? And but to my utter surprise, instead I took them and it just seemed to make me feel more affirmed in who I was and made me it allowed me to gain more confidence in living life as a woman actually because it the psychedelics allowed me to resolve a lot of the fears, a lot of the anxieties I had about going out into the world as a woman. And so they really helped me to be more comfortable that way. But yeah, eventually, then my experience has been that every psychedelic experience builds on the previous one. It's kind of like gaining new pieces of a puzzle. And and if
Mm-hmm.
I do them intentionally, which I always do them intentionally with a specific intention of something I'm trying to resolve in my life. And when I do that, I will gain this whole new perspective on whatever it is I was trying to learn. But then that new perspective, when I do another journey, the follow up journey plays into that one. And it just happened that it progressed like this to where eventually last year, enough enough of the puzzle pieces came together that I finally saw things I could not unsee. I
Mm-hmm.
realized what was happening, that I was living as a woman only because of my childhood programming. And when I realized that and realized that it did not make any sense anymore and it wasn't serving me anymore, it didn't feel right anymore, then the mushrooms, the psychedelic mushrooms, really allowed me to resolve that, to figure out how to go back to living as a man, because that was one of my biggest fears. How the hell do I ever go back to living as a man after living
Yeah.
this way for 6 years? What are people going to think about me? The whole narrative of my mom that I heard come out of her mouth my whole life. What are people going to think about me? That came up in me. I was so afraid people are going to think I'm some sort of crazy person, as if they didn't
Mm-hmm.
already for living as trans. I thought I can't undo that. But then the psychedelics helped me to understand. They basically told me almost verbally, those who were judging you for being trans are just going to welcome you back into the world and are going to say, welcome back to reality. And so then I was like, oh, I guess there's nothing to fear. I'll, I'll
Mm-hmm.
be, it'll be like I'm just going back to normal. And so I was able to, yeah, it was a scary thing though, because I was for a while really scared what people are going to think about me.
So has detransitioning, if you want to call it that, has that affected any of your friendships and relationships? Has it kind of cast you out of any community you're in or anything like that?
I was, when you're trans, there is this whole community that welcomes you in, and it's amazing when you identify that way because you're already in a world that doesn't want to accept you. So then there's this community that says, oh, we accept you, come here, we
Mm-hmm.
be whoever you want to be and be your authentic self. And so I, of course, when I first was transitioning, I sought out local queer groups that my wife and I would go to, queer open mic nights and poetry and things, because I felt like I fit in there. I was welcome. And naturally, when I detransitioned and went back to living as a man, those groups, they see me as a threat now, because
Mm-hmm.
now I am definitely not affirming to their identities. And I used to feel the same way about other detransitioners. When someone would go back to their birth gender, it would cause me to suddenly question myself. Well, what's going on here? If they're going back to their birth gender, what's that mean about me? Is that going to happen to me? And I had those fears for a long time. But I lost the LGBTQ community, the trans community. I had some trans friends on Facebook that when I started telling my story, they started getting on there and telling me that I was a horrid person, that I'm trying to eradicate the world of trans people. And I said, no, I'm not. I love everybody. I recognize
Mhm.
that this is real for you. For trans people, it absolutely feels real. And therefore, I you could never convince someone they're not trans. I mean, I like to think that there's the right thing that could be said that might plant a seed possibly, but when you're in that delusion like I was, you just cannot see anything else. It just feels so real. As far as my family goes, the instant I detransitioned, my dad offered to fly me and my family to Hawaii for a vacation, which felt felt a little weird at the time to myself still, or being so fresh out of being trans, because I felt almost like it was a way of saying, oh, now that you're back to normal reality, now I'll fly you to Hawaii. But before that,
Mm.
no. So that was interesting. And my mom, of course, was all happy to have her son back, she said. And there's parts
Mm.
that where I can understand that. I can understand how they would be happy and relieved for that. But then at the same time, I was like, but wait a minute, didn't you love me before? Shouldn't you love me no matter how I express myself? But I totally get it. It's different.
Yeah, sounds very complicated, and I can confirm after reading your book that you definitely don't have a hostile mindset towards any trans people. I was actually going into it kind of expecting you to be like a little bit more critical and a little bit more on one side, but from what I got from it, you're actually really on the almost pro transgender side for the majority of the book, and then kind of at the end you say, the kind of your words of caution. So I think, and I definitely got the sense that as you were writing it, you're trying to speak to people who
Mm,
have gone through the same struggles that you have, to maybe help them to think a little farther into the future.
right.
So with that being said, was there I know you said you had kind of a rough experience when you would encounter a detransitioner. Was there any detransitioners that you saw that kind of had that same effect on you that you want to have on other people? Like, is there any that you looked up to or that received inspiration from?
you know, if you're familiar with Walt Heyer, he's the owner of
Mm-hmm.
sexchangeregret.com and wrote books and
Mm-hmm.
things. When I was first transitioning, my mother actually reached out to him and was talking to him personally, trying to get him to help bring me back to reality. And I I never really, I guess, respected his position. I thought that clearly I used to be one of the ones that said, well, he wasn't really trans. If he detransitioned, that
Mm-hmm.
means he wasn't really trans. I'm really trans. This is never changing. So that's not me. And then I would see there's a local doctor that we he treated our daughter one time for an ear infection or whatever, and he was trans at the time that he treated our daughter, and I was still in the closet. I hadn't transitioned yet. So as he was treating our daughter that day, and I'm sitting there, oh, well, this gives me a little more confidence to transition myself. But then eventually he detransitioned and went back to
Mm-hmm.
living as a man, and that that put me into a bit of depression for days when I discovered that on Facebook, saw his male pictures up again, and said that he was going back to living as male. And it just really freaked me out because I guess I was far enough into my transition at this point and had watched him transition or be a woman for however many years only to go back to being a man. And then here I am now having transitioned, living as a woman. And I thought, well, what does this mean about me? I I still was firm in my belief that I was female and that I wasn't the same as him, that he clearly wasn't really trans to begin with, like I said before. But yeah, it seeing detrans people really caused me to question my whole identity and whether
Hmm.
it was valid or not. And so I like to hope that sharing my story will at least plant seeds of doubt.
Hmm. Yeah, one thing that really comes across clear in your book is that you're really kind of the perfect case for somebody being transgender. You know, you express
Mm.
these things at a very young age. So in that sense, I think it really shows like just how convinced you can be. Not that I'm saying that necessarily everyone should be detransitioning or anything like that, but it really shows like how extreme you can be with the confirming things, and then still many years later kind of come out and realize that that wasn't your true identity. So with that being said, I want to get into your mindset when you were first starting to write the book. So I've been trying to be a writer and an author myself, and I know it's an interesting experience, like the sparks of inspiration that we get and how important and how crucial they seem at the time. But then maybe you get another spark of inspiration a little bit later, and sometimes those sparks can even be contradictory. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering what was that first spark of like, wow, I need to write a book, and I'm assuming it's fairly pro transgender spark.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. When I first started that book, I was like, people need to hear that being trans is real and that this is what it's like. And initially, my book was mostly going to be about what it was like growing up with a trans identity in the Mormon church. In fact, the title of the book, I initially titled it something else that included Mormon in the title because I that was the whole point, is I wanted it to be about my Mormon experience and being trans. And it was very pro trans, like, this is reality, you people just need to accept this. And so it
Mm-hmm.
was crazy when I realized that I needed to go back and completely rewrite the whole thing based on my new realizations. Because yeah, initially when I started writing it, I was doing so to make people aware of the reality of being trans, that it was real.
Yeah, you talk about in your book kind of some of the struggles. So it sounds like you were writing it for about a 4 year period of time, which is pretty long. I mean, it's a pretty long book, but that's still a quite a long time to be writing. So I'm wondering, um, yeah, you write about like the struggle that you went through with like actually sitting down and writing your book every day. So I'm wondering, is there a point as you were kind of realizing that maybe you had wasted time on this? Like, was there a point where you're just like, let's just scrap the whole thing and just not finish it at all, or did you struggle with anything like that?
Not well, early on when I started writing it and I was realizing how long it was taking me to get any substance written down, there was times where I considered, well, what is this even worth? And of course, at that time, it was just talking about my trans experience, and I was going through some feelings of inadequacy and lack of confidence and things anyway. So I was like, why would anybody want to hear from me as it is? So
Hmm.
I did consider just scrapping it a few times. But then I kept working on it, and there was times where I'd go a couple months without writing anything in it because nothing was just I just wasn't in a place and nothing was coming to me.
Hmm.
But I just kept working on it little bits here and there. And so then it was quite disappointing to realize I'd spent so many years writing it one way to have to go back and rewrite it.
Yeah. So, okay, so now that we're to this point, I think I want to get into a little bit about the actual steps that you took towards transition and whether you think that the system you went through was handled well or if it could be handled better. So, what was, I know you talked about a forum that you came across that was kind of like your first interaction with seeing other transitioners. So, kind of walk me through the steps that you took to get to where you got.
Yeah. So, in the craziest thing, for most of my life, I grew up not even knowing transgender was a thing. I knew drag queens were a thing, and I knew I definitely wasn't that because I recognized a drag queen as being someone that was a man that dressed as a woman for fun and then went back to being a man. And I wanted nothing to do with being a man, period. I just thought I was a girl inside. But I had no idea such a thing existed. I had never been around trans people. I didn't even know the concept existed that anybody could identify as a different gender than in their body. And I don't know how, other than that I was homeschooled, raised in the country, not exposed to very much. We had TV, but trans people have never been very much on TV as it is. And so I was in my 20s in the early 2000s before I ever even discovered what it meant to be transgender. I had searched the internet so many hundreds of times. Why do I feel like a girl? What is with this? Why do I feel like I'm a girl in a boy's body? And all these search terms that would never bring up anything for some reason. I don't know if it just
Hmm.
wasn't meant to be at the time because I'm a internet savvy person. I can find anything I want to on there, but not then and not about that. And so finally, in my mid 20s, I came across this susansplace.org, a transgender people's internet forum, and I was absolutely blown away. I just started crying, tears of unnecessarily relief, but recognizing that I wasn't alone in the world because I literally thought I was the only person on the entire planet that felt like I was literally the wrong gender in my
Hmm.
male body. And it was the weirdest thing to grow up with, believing that I was the only one on the whole earth that felt that way. And so when I discovered there was actually thousands of other people out there that felt the same way, I felt so not alone suddenly, like there was others like me out there. And so I've spent hours on that internet forum reading all these other people's stories, and it felt so good to hear other people going through the same thing, having the same experiences, feeling the same things that I did. But I was living up in Oregon at the time and was driving my logging truck in a heavily masculine dominated environment, and testosterone at this point had made my body very much male. And so even though I discovered susansplace.org and discovered that it was possible to start female hormones and have surgery and things to make my body match how I felt inside, I thought it was just too late. My body had already been turned into a man by this testosterone for all these years. I might as well not even bother. But I still kind of looked into up in Oregon, looked for gender therapists, and when I would find one, they'd be like a couple hour drive away, and it just felt like there was so much against me ever achieving transition. So I just basically decided to try to crush the feelings and find a girlfriend, which I did up in Oregon. I found one girlfriend, and then we were together for a while, and I proposed to her after only 3 months, as in Mormon standard. And but then shortly after that, she left me, and I was devastated. And then I met my current wife in Colorado, and I moved out to Colorado to be with her. And then it was after we were together for about a year that we were watching that documentary, Gender Revolution, National Geographic. It was a Katie Couric documentary. And in that documentary, it just shows a few different trans people's lives, and it showed a husband and wife who went through transition together. And as we're sitting there watching that show, my wife had already known that I like to wear women's clothing, and she would buy me skirts and dresses and things, but she didn't know that I actually wanted or felt like I was a woman trapped in a man's body. And so after we watched that show, it triggered something in her, and we paused it, and she turned and looked at me and said, "Is that what you want? Do you want to start female hormones and actually be a woman?" And my heart started beating like crazy because I, I wasn't prepared for that question, but absolutely, yes. I was like, I'm so happy you're asking that because, yes, that is absolutely what I want. That would make my dreams come true because I was hoping that being married would make those feelings go away, that perhaps having a woman in my life was what I needed and that I didn't actually need to be a woman. But that turned out to absolutely not be true. Even though I was married, those feelings absolutely persisted relentlessly. And so, yeah, I came out to her in 2016, but then it was another year before I finally sought out a therapist to get hormones. Kind of let it simmer for a year or so, and then in 2017 I looked for a gender therapist that could help me get the letter of recommendation so that I could get hormones, and found a local gender therapist, saw them. They're non-binary, and saw them for, I think it was a few visits before I had the letter for estrogen. And then I took that straight to my endocrinologist at Kaiser, and she prescribed me estrogen. And that was the most euphoric thing in the world the first time I took that
Hmm.
estrogen pill, because it felt like it was confirming who I always felt I was inside, and was starting the process of changing my body to become female. And
Well, one
yeah,
quick question there. I've heard when people first start taking, especially from male to female, when they first start taking estrogen, first of all, did you? Oh, I guess yeah, you wouldn't need puberty blockers, but I think there's like testosterone blocker, and then
yeah.
also, did the estrogen? I've heard it can really mess with your brain, give you kind of brain fog and lack of mental clarity and energy in general. Did you have that, or was it all kind of on the euphoric side at first?
I'm sure there was a lot of, yeah. It did definitely cause me less clarity of mind and cause me to become very emotional. But for the most part, as most trans people would say, because it felt like it was so amazing and euphoric, I overlooked any negative side effects because I just thought it was all good, that it's making me a woman finally. So I don't care if it's making me a little groggy or foggy or whatever. I just push through, and yeah.
Hmm. So this brings us basically to your surgery, and there's an interesting part of your book that I think kind of highlights your mindset at the time, just before you were going through surgery. It says, "One of my greatest fears, overshadowing even the inherent risks of the surgery itself, was the possibility that I might awaken from anesthesia only to discover that the operation had been aborted. The thought of continuing to live with a penis, an aspect of my body that felt so incongruent with my identity, was unbearable. The prospect of this surgery being canceled, leaving me trapped in a physical state that felt so alien to my true self, was a nightmarish scenario. I welcomed dying on the operating table over the possibility of waking up and discovering that some complication prevented them from performing the surgery." So what gets brought to your mind when you take yourself back to that time?
That was a crazy time because I was ready to end it all. If I couldn't get rid of that penis, if I couldn't have the a vagina on my body and feel like I had the actual body part that was supposed to be on my body, I I was basically done living. And that is so crazy to recognize that I could arrive at that place where I was ready to kill myself if I couldn't have the surgery, but to now be where I'm at and to realize that I could have a belief that was that strong, that would make me think it was that necessary only now to recognized that it was never necessary in the first place. And that's why I see this as such a struggle, because other trans people that are in the same place that I was then, that feel that same way, how do you ever convince someone that is literally ready to end their own life if they don't get this surgery? How can you convince them that it's not actually going to fix anything? It's not going to bring you the
Hmm.
happiness you want. The happiness comes from within. It's your own relationship to whatever is going on in your life. And yeah, I was literally, when I went under that anesthesia, I was so afraid I was going to wake up and have to be faced with that penis still on my body, and I was not going to have anything to do with it. I
So, just a question that's coming up is I know this whole topic of suicide is a pretty prominent thing in the transgender community, very controversial. And I know there's a risk of, because people talk about it in the light of trans people have this increased chance of killing themselves, that it actually kind of turns into a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
mm,
Do you feel like you were influenced by hearing that at all, or do you think this suicide thing was all coming from within for you?
I personally felt like it was all from within, from my own perspectives, because for one, initially when I felt like I was female inside and felt like I was the only one on the whole planet, suicidal thoughts crossed my mind back then too, when I wasn't even exposed to any trans ideology or any news articles or anything. I didn't even know it existed, but it was something that I struggled so much with to recognize that it makes me so different in the world, that how can I possibly live in this world so different, that I the thought crossed my mind to kill myself just to escape from whatever tragedy this is, of living with this feeling that I'm in the wrong body. And and then by the time I had the surgery, it was kind of the same thing, that I just felt like, how could I possibly live in this world feeling this way and not get to experience it? And
Mm-hmm.
so any thoughts of suicide were basically just to escape the pain of trying to live in this world with those feelings, knowing that I could not live true to what the feelings were trying to make me feel like I had to.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why
Well,
feelings, it's just so crazy that our own feelings can be so strong and direct our thoughts to such an extent that we would think something is so necessary.
mm-hmm. Well, on the topic of suicide, I think this brings me to the last excerpt I'll read of your book, and then some questions I have around that. You write, I've come to understand the intricate connection between my ego and my shame. My ego emerges as a guardian of this shame, intervening to ensure that the insatiable, voracious black whirlpool of shame is satiated, preventing it from spiraling out of control and leading to thoughts of the ultimate escape, suicide. In other words, my ego stands as the ultimate protector of my deepest shadows, the most vulnerable parts of myself. So, you definitely talk about in the book, you've had multiple struggles with suicide throughout your life for various different reasons, whether it was your weight while you were in the trucking company where you almost wanted to run into that concrete barrier.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, so after you have the surgery, and I've heard you talk about in other podcasts some of the grief that you've experienced. So did that suicide thing come up again? And just talk about the grief in general, about once you realized the mistake that you had made around the surgery.
Yeah, when it's crazy how, yeah, we all want comfort. We want happiness, confidence, safety, and when life feels unsafe and uncomfortable, we want to escape that somehow. And I definitely identified, well, perhaps ending my life might be a way to escape all of this uncomfortable feelings and emotions I'm struggling with. And when I detransitioned and realized the horrid mistake I had made, the permanence of the decision I had made to have my body surgically altered, And that grief came up of realizing the absolute permanence that I can never undo that. I i definitely fell into a serious state of depression again, deeper than I had ever experienced before. And of
Mm.
course, along with that came additional thoughts of suicide, even though now I had detransitioned and living as my biological male self again. I'm doing so without a penis, without the right body parts, and therefore psychologically it's really, really difficult to try to align myself as a man, but knowing I don't have the body parts of a man. And so that brought up so much extreme grief and depression in me that again I thought, well, now maybe ending it all would be a good option again. But luckily, as I've worked through it and processed the grief around that, I'm now able to recognize I have what I have. Happiness is what we make it, and my relationship to the world around me, I can I've been learning to integrate, learning to fall back into life and what it means to be a man without a penis, and that it doesn't matter. Nobody can see that I don't have one. So as far as people around me are concerned, there's no reason I can't just live normal in life, and that's what I've been doing lately, and it's been great. Happier than I've ever been before, because now I don't struggle with those internal feelings anymore that I'm in the wrong body,
Mm.
other than being a man now and being in the wrong body again as far as that goes. And I talk about gender dysphoria. Initially, I experienced such gender dysphoria feeling like I'm a girl, looking down and seeing the male body. Now I feel like a man and I look down and see a female body. So I'm
Mm.
still dealing with gender dysphoria, even though I'm back to living as a man. And it's the craziest thing. Crazy experience I would not ever wish for anybody to have to go
Mm.
through.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds like a lot. How much, how much of this grief that you're talking about around, particularly the bottom surgery, how much of it is related to the effect that you knew it had on your wife?
Mm. Tremendous amounts, because yeah, I see firsthand how it affects her, and how it did affect her to lose that part of me and that amazing intimate connection that only that allows two people to have. You can, of course, you can be intimate together, and we've figured out how to be intimate together in other ways with what I've got now. But that's an incredible intimate connection that you cannot have any other way than with those particular body parts. And when I detransitioned and realized, see, it was one thing to take that body part away from my wife and that intimacy away from my wife when I was fully identifying as female, because I, just like anything, when you have to justify it to yourself, I I did. I said, well, this just has to be. I guess this is just a sacrifice that has to be made. We have to do away with my penis because this is who I really am, and I'm really sorry this affects you, but this is how it is. But after the fact, when I realized that it wasn't really how it was and that it never should have happened, that caused me an extreme amount of grief, knowing that my action affected her. That it wasn't just me, it's not only my body that's being affected, but she's married to me, and she married me as a man, loving me for all I was as a man, including my penis. And when I got rid of it, that was taking something away from her. And it
Mm-hmm.
was very selfish of me to only think about myself in that was necessary for me to have the surgery. So yeah, I have a lot of grief now knowing that specifically, that I took it away from her. Not only grief for myself, but for how it affected her.
Yeah, so in the book, you talk about how she was really supportive throughout the whole thing, which is pretty hard to kind of wrap your head around because of what exactly she's supporting there, and how big the ramifications of that decision could be. Is there, I mean, with all due respect to her, is there some part of you that wishes maybe she would have pushed back a little bit more?
Yeah, that that one is really difficult because I mean she's always been very familiar with trauma. She's trauma informed. She's a therapist herself, and so she understands what goes into psychology of people and our identities just like I did. She understands what causes a person to develop habits and things over the course of their life and beliefs. But, and she kind of mostly, yeah, I don't, she was put in a real tough position and she talks about that,
Mhm.
that she loved me and she wanted to support me. And so she had to be really careful with how she navigated any discussion with me. If she ever mentioned anything about me being a man, I would reject it hardcore. If she would say anything about my masculinity, I would basically say, fuck you. I have no masculinity. I'm a woman. Keep that to yourself. And yeah,
Yeah, sounds like a really difficult situation to be in. I can't imagine what I would do if I were in it.
right.
So I think we're coming up on an hour here, so I think I want to start wrapping things up. So I'm curious, just as an author in somewhat of a similar situation to you, is because you wrote this book, and I'm sure you considered like the different publishing avenues and how there may be difficulties around that given the topic that you're writing about. How did you kind of wrestle with the idea? Like, did you start writing this knowing that that a major publisher probably would never pick it up?
I actually started writing it with full confidence that it will get published. And in fact, I submitted it to a publisher, and they got back to me, and they accepted it, but they wanted money
Hmm.
up front to publish it, and
Oh.
I felt like it was a situation where if they really wanted to publish this book, they should be paying me for it. And so I kind of passed on that one and decided to self publish it until another publisher comes along. And I've submitted it to other ones, and I've had some interest, but yeah, some of the bigger publishers haven't got back to me yet. I'm sure the book could still use some work, some editing work, but so I've been interested to see what a publisher would actually do with it and how much of it they'd want me to change, because
Hmm.
and I'd only want it changed so much as far as it would be making it better. I don't want them to
Hmm.
fundamentally change its message to where it changes what I was trying to do with it. And that was one of the reasons I chose to pursue self publishing, so I could keep it how I wanted it. But
Hmm.
I would really
Yeah.
welcome a big publisher to take it.
Yeah. I guess I'm just thinking kind of like because there seems to be a bit of like ideological capture for a lot of the big publishers, and then I mean even just your title, transgender, it's a belief, it can change. I could really see that probably pissing off a lot of those bigger people, but I
Yeah.
mean there are publishers like have you heard of Helen Joyce, the writer?
Mm, maybe sounds familiar, but no, I don't.
She wrote a book that's pretty critical of all the new transgender ideas, but I mean, and
Uh,
she got a major publisher, so there's definitely there's probably somewhat of a broad scope of beliefs that these publishers do have, so
yeah.
I'm wondering, so what's the future for you? Are you planning any more books or anything like that?
Yes, I anticipate writing a lot more because I mean it's an ever evolving world we're in, and even as far as the trans topic, I don't know that I'll necessarily write always about the trans topic, but
Hmm.
I I do love to write and always pictured myself authoring books, and this just happened to provide me with a very fascinating topic. And And once I started making YouTube videos about the topic, realizing how hot of a topic it is right now. And so I anticipate probably writing some more books on the trans issue that speak specifically to some of the nuances of what my personal experience has made me aware of, I guess.
Have you ever considered writing any fiction or anything like that, or you like sticking to more biographical or and educational type things?
Uh, yeah, I guess I've never really liked reading fiction that much, so I guess it kind of goes along. I prefer to write more informational
Mm-hmm.
stuff. Although one of my, I don't know if you saw on Amazon, I also have another book called Channeling
Hmm.
JFK, which
Oh wow.
being growing up Mormon, I always believed that the only people that were capable of receiving anything from God or the field were prophets. And then the more I did psychedelics and the more I realized we all have access to the field and consciousness. And when I realized what consciousness was, and one time it just came to me that I was to write this channeled book from JFK, but not from JFK. People like to question that, like, wait, what do you know about John F. Kennedy? It's not
Mm-hmm.
actual the identity of John F. Kennedy, but it came to me the understanding that JFK had access to a higher level of consciousness that had he continued to live, he would have shared with us lessons
Mm.
that we never got to hear from him because he was assassinated. And so my book Channeling
Mm-hmm.
JFK, I didn't even know what it was going to be about. It's entirely channeled where I would sit at my computer and put myself in a trance state and just write whatever came, and the
Mm-hmm.
result was some pretty detailed information about who we are, where we came from, why we're here, what consciousness is. It blew me away myself as I'm sitting
Mm.
there writing it. Like, this is not coming from me. I mean, I don't know what you believe about channeling, but there's a lot of channelers out there, and it's a real
Mm.
questionable practice. And so I just decided to give it a try, just see what would come. And I was actually amazed. And
Wow,
yeah,
that's very interesting. I know, and with this book, you definitely get into a lot of the philosophical things that you believe. That seems to be kind of at the core of why you write in general.
yeah,
So I think we'll go ahead and end with that. So I just want to say once again, thank you for being my first guest and also my first subscriber. So hopefully we can stay in touch and hopefully help to strengthen the community that can benefit from stories like yours.
yeah. I really appreciate it. I loved that you bought my book and read it and used it in the interview because that was the first for me. And it offered a
Yeah, I
lot of
really. Oh, go ahead.
opportunity for a lot of conversation.
Hmm. Yeah, I really wanted to show my appreciation for the fact that you accepted it. So I figured that would be a good way to kind of pay you back in a way.
Yeah, I really appreciate that.
Of course. All right. Well, you take care and I'll see you around.
All right. Well, thank you so much.